Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. This is Penny from Wisconsin Land & Water, and I'm the Conservation Training and Membership Services Coordinator there. And welcome to the webinar, Alley Cropping. And today our presenter is going to be Richard Straight from the U.S. Forest Service, and we're happy to have him join us. And I think it's time to turn it over to Rich.
Thank you, Penny. And I appreciate this opportunity, and it's a great way to start the year. I like the way this has been set up to provide training. So we'll get right into it. And we are going to focus on alley cropping today. And there we go. So hopefully now you're seeing the outline for today. There's a number of points. We won't spend a lot of time on some of them, but I'm going to take this opportunity to start off talking about briefly the National Agroforestry Center. We'll do a few definitions, and then we'll really get into the alley cropping practice standard. And I'm going to do that primarily by going over the purposes that are listed in the Wisconsin Conservation Practice Standard for alley cropping. And then I'm going to point out some potential concerns that you want to be aware of in general when working with a producer or landowner, rather than just making a blanket statement that alley cropping is good everywhere all the time, and we know that that's not true. And then we'll comment on a few other design considerations, a few comments on some species selection criteria, and then there are a few items that Andy wanted me to make sure that you all knew about programs as they relate to alley cropping there in Wisconsin. So with that, so the Agroforestry Center is a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We're located in Lincoln, Nebraska, and our director is located in Washington, D.C. You can see on this slide we have two main branches within the center, and branches may be an exaggeration because you can see we're not a lot of people, so maybe two main twigs within the center. So part of that is our technology transfer and application, or the outreach education group, which is myself and Kate McFarland, and more recently Lord Amaya with the NRCS in a shared position with the Nebraska Forest Service. So we have three folks there. And then on the research side, we have three research positions. Only two of those have retired recently. So we have one researcher, GI specialist, and then we have our administrative person who takes care of all of our budget, and there's our website. So it's potentially a group of 11, but we're down to about 7 folks because of some recent retirements. So on the education outreach, hopefully some of you have seen some of our publications. We have brochures, which are usually a 3-fold brochure. We have some technical notes, which are a little more detailed and technical, really targeted toward the resource professionals who provide assistance to landowners. And in the last couple of years, we just now made that only an online or PDF document, whereas the rest of these are in print as well. And then we have information sheets, which are just front and back of a single sheet that highlight maybe a very narrow topic as agroforestry might relate to a specific issue. And then we have a newsletter that has been missing for about a year now, but we just came out with the most recent issue back in December, and we try to highlight a particular theme on each newsletter and cover agroforestry around the country. We also have some sample presentations that you can download and use. We have a few tools that our researchers help develop, and we also have some displays that you can request to use at no cost, except for return shipment, and we'll ship those to you for free. We're also involved in a number of activities, such as helping to support demonstration sites, training, online training like we are today, other types of workshops, and we've also been working with some regional agroforestry working groups that help provide more detailed, more local information on agroforestry. On the research side, we're really focused on new ideas, and then our researchers have done a lot of work on more like synthesis and models to help in the decision-making related to agroforestry. And one mentioned right there is the conservation buffer plant database. And we're running this just for the Northern Plains right now to help in choosing plants to provide multiple benefits. We've also involved with the conservation buffers. This is an interesting publication that looks at all the different aspects that various kinds of conservation buffers can provide, not just agroforestry, and can work you through understanding what the research says. And so this is a synthesis of research. And then we have a more recent publication related to agroforestry and climate change that's also available online. And then here are a few of the key topics related that our researchers are looking at right now. And one in particular is related to pollinators. And Gary Bentrup in our office has been doing some work with the Xerces Society and a few others here at the University of Nebraska on pollinators and agroforestry. So that's just a very brief overview of the center, but I wanted to put that out in front of folks. So we're going to start off a little broader than alley cropping. Let's talk about agroforestry and what is agroforestry. And to be honest with you, back in the early 90s, I thought it was one of those mashup words, and it was new to me. And technically it is kind of a mashup word. It's agriculture, and we think of agriculture as annual crops, tilling, as well as grazing and livestock, and integrating that with trees. So there's your definition online, and you can find a number of definitions related to agroforestry. But the idea is that when we talk about agroforestry, we talk about the 4 I's. So it's not just that woody plants, trees happen to be growing near annual crops or near livestock, but that this is an intentional integration of trees or shrubs into a farming system. And then the benefits that we talk about on environmental, economic, and social benefits are achieved through intensive management of the interactions among the plants and the animals that we put into these systems. And so this graphic, I think, does a nice job of laying out if trees, forest lands are at the top of this triangle, and tilled land, tilled crops in the lower left, and livestock to the lower right, just pure applications. Then agroforestry is really in the middle there, and we and it's where those get integrated. So as you see, the edges of those are sort of hazy because it doesn't have to be just very rigidly defined as percentage of trees and percentage of cropland, or percentage of land covered with trees and percentage covered with forage crops. And although for practical purposes in managing conservation programs and working with people, it helps to have some more discrete categories. So we talk about the 5 agroforestry practices, and those 5 are the silvopasture, windbreaks, riparian buffers, alley cropping, and multi-story cropping, or some people call it forest farming. And as you can see just by those pictures, you can see that it's a sort of a gradient between the maybe the ratio of trees in the landscape to tilled land, and these aren't just hard and fast lines. So the idea is that we're integrating woody and annual crops and or livestock into a system, and we do that in primarily we talk about 5 different practices, and NRCS uses the conservation practice standards. They're listed here, and the second URL, which I'll have on another slide as well, we've created a map on the National Agroforestry Center website that you can click on an agroforestry practice and see which states use that practice, or you can click on your state and it tells you which of the agroforestry practices your state has a practice standard for. And it's good to remember that with our conservation practices, although they often have a benefit to the producer in that they aid in production or increase productivity or sustainability of their farming operation, that from the conservation practice standard in our programs primarily are focused on those conservation benefits. And agroforestry does a nice job of walking on both sides of the street, in that these are productive systems that produce products, crops that provide an income, as well as providing many of the conservation benefits or addressing the resource concerns that our programs are out there to address. And so with alley cropping, like agroforestry, you can probably find quite a variety of definitions. But basically, what we're talking about are one or a single or multiple rows of trees or shrubs, woody plants, that are grown to provide a harvestable crop. And in the alleyway between those rows of woody plants are other crops. And often these are cultivated crops, although they can be perennial crops like a 4-H crop. And so the trees create an alleyway, and hence the term alley cropping. Well, in our conservation practice standard, as you're all quite aware, are set up. They have the same format, so we know where to go in the standard to find the information that we're looking for. And so the Wisconsin alley cropping practice standard, the 311, there's the definition, and it sounds very familiar to what we just talked about. And then the purposes or the resource concerns that this practice may be used to address, and then where the practice can be applied. And then we get into some basic criteria, and we're going to touch base on most of these as we go through. And then there'll be additional criteria if you're trying to address a specific issue rather than alley cropping in general. And then we'll get into some other considerations, as I mentioned earlier, and maybe a little bit on management. And of course, there are other supporting documents for the conservation practice standards, but this is generally how they're built, and that's how we're going to proceed today. And I'm really going to focus on those conservation purposes for the main body of this presentation. So agroforestry, here's that map that I mentioned, that interactive map on the Agroforestry Center site, and you can see that many states utilize have alley cropping as one of the practice standards that they offer within the state. And we try to update that about twice a year, although we've had some changeover on personnel, and we haven't got around to updating it more recently, but we'll be doing that fairly soon. And then Wisconsin actually does have all 5 of the agroforestry practices available for use within the state. So these next 2 slides are just a listing of those purposes that are listed in the practice standard. And we talk about agroforestry as being working trees, that is, trees that have a function or a purpose. And in alley cropping, some of the benefits that we experience are because the trees and your other crops have different rooting systems. They have they're growing differently at different times of the year. It's perennial as compared to annual crops, and that there's diversity in the plant material that gets shed off of these plants, that get organic matter that gets incorporated into the soil, as well as within the root system. So we are creating diversity with the organic matter that's ends up being incorporated into the soil, and that the trees or shrubs stand up above the soil and many times up above the crops, means that we also provide, it impacts the microenvironment on that site. And so by having the diversity of structure and the diversity of organic matter, we can we can manage it in such a way to provide more than one benefit at a time. But as you're well aware, that all those purposes cannot be achieved all at one time by one single application of a practice. Those are potential practices or potential purposes that can be addressed, and we may have to modify the specifics to achieve or prioritize one of those purposes over another. And what we're doing is we're managing the interactions as the perennial annual crops, so the livestock compete for light and water and nutrients and physical space on the landscape. And we also take advantage of how those different plants work together in providing different types of habitat and their impacts on the soil and nutrient capture and modification of the microclimate. So all those purposes are achievable, but not all at the same time. And that's just really good to remember that just like any other conservation practice, this isn't a silver bullet that'll fix everything, but can be used along with other good management practices to provide the environmental public benefit, as well as assisting the producer on having a profitable and sustainable agricultural system on their landscape, on their property. So one of the benefits, or two of the purposes that are listed there, are enhance the microclimatic conditions to improve crop or forage quality and quantity, and then improve air quality. And this is primarily achieved because, again, once our trees have grown up and gained some height, they reduce the wind speed of the blowing over the field or this plot of land where we have installed this alley cropping. And when the wind speed is reduced, that has a number of impacts on evapotranspiration rates off of plants, water loss from exposed soil. It reduces blowing soil, which can abrade or negatively impact young emerging plants, and increases humidity. Now that may be an issue, maybe a problem if you have crops that have some leaf spot fungal issues. And so again, you'd want to manage how much wind speed reduction you have by the density of the types of trees that are used. And then the air quality aspect is primarily on the reduced wind erosion of soil by keeping fine particulate down and not allowing it to get lifted into the air. So that's the microclimate. On the producer side, these microclimatic changes, if you look at some of the information that's on our website about windbreaks and look into windbreak benefits, you see that because the temperature can be modified, both daytime and nighttime temperature, and the temperature of the soil, that some crops, some vegetable crops, can actually come into or mature earlier in the growing season because of these improved conditions and reduced evapotranspiration and reduced heat loss or heat convection during the evening. And you can actually bring product to market earlier, and product can be less bruising and damage from wind-blown impacts on crops that are grown in between the trees grown in the alleyways. So there's that modification of microclimate. Another benefit is just the diversity of crops on the landscape, and that impacts the producer's operation from a financial point of view. Often we'll find that different crops respond differently to weather pattern changes, and markets change as well. And by having diverse crops, you're less likely to hit a downturn where say the price or the yield of all the crops are down all at the same time if you have diversity. And that diversity also, we'll get into habitat later on one of the other benefits. Soil health has become quite the buzzword lately, and for good reason. I think the NRCS, its roots as a soil conservation service, has always had a strong focus on soil and managing soil, and primarily, of the key elements that we talk about with soil health is keeping soil in place, keeping soil covered, so that the biological function within the soil can help create over time soil structure, which improves infiltration and allows roots to have better access to available nutrients within the soil and water within the soil. Well, the more recent emphasis on soil health is also looking at the biological activity related to the plants that we grow and how we grow plants on the soil, within the soil. And by having a diversity of crops, I think I mentioned earlier that, roots as they grow are constantly sloughing organic material and compounds off into the soil. And as the leaf litter and twigs and things fall from our crops or from the trees and shrubs that we plant, they're providing a variety of types and sources of organic matter that can go into the soil and feed the microbiome. And the rooting systems of plants are also different as far as are they shallow and spread out, or are they deeper? And by having a variety of plants and rooting systems, we have better utilization of nutrients in the soil and cycling of nutrients within the soil. Again, by having some perennial vegetation on the landscape and how we orient that, such as maybe planting the tree rows of our alley cropping on contour or perennial vegetation under those trees because we're not tilling it, we can reduce the surface water runoff. We reduce the speed at which water moves across the landscape, giving it more time for infiltration into the soil, where our crops, both our tree and our alleyway crops, can take up that water and process it to grow strong and healthy plants. And so by having perennial vegetation on the landscape, we impact the movement of water across the landscape and help it slow down and percolate into the soil, and particularly if it's carrying sediment or nutrients that have been applied on an alley crop, those nutrients can stay more likely to stay on site and utilized rather than running off and downstream where they don't do the producer any good. In the same way, by having a variety of roots within the soil, we can experience a greater capture of nutrients and water within the soil because those roots are growing in different depths. And another purpose within this practice standard is they alter subsurface water quantity or water table depth. And I'll be honest with you folks, that's not one I've seen a lot of research on. It's a little bit intuitive that by having perennial plants that are growing earlier in the growing season than maybe our annual or tilled crops are going in, and later in the growing season than, again, an annual crop would be growing, that you're going to be taking up probably some more water. That makes some sense, but to be honest with you, we don't have anything or very little information that's quantifiable, and to say that this is a practice we're going to use to reduce or lower the water table depth. And I hate to say it that way, but it's a topic that we probably could use some more information on, and as these practices get reviewed, we should try and incorporate some of that information in the practice standard, so if this is an issue, one could possibly utilize this practice. And I'm just going to say right now that I just have not seen this practice applied for that purpose of altering the subsurface water quantity or water table depth. If you have questions or experience with that, it'd be an interesting conversation to have here at the end of this presentation. Carbon storage continues to be a topic of interest, depending where you're at and the producer you're working with. The idea here is that by growing woody plants, we know that say in U.S. forest lands fix about 250 million metric tons of atmospheric carbon each year, and that cropland sequesters somewhere between 75 to 200 million metric tons, and grasslands 30 to 90 million metric tons of atmospheric carbon. And research has shown within with windbreaks and alley cropping, that by combining these perennial plants with woody roots under the ground and the larger plant biomass above ground, that on a given acre of ground, we can sequester additional carbon than we can on with an annual cropping system. And because we have that combined plants material below and above ground. So that can be an issue of that a person's interested in growing crops and sequestering more carbon because of a local market, a carbon market, or just their interest in this topic. Alley cropping is one way to achieve that. Wildlife is, if you read any survey on producers and landowners, wildlife is nearly always in the top 3 to 4 areas of interest that they have. And whenever a producer is saying they like wildlife or want to apply practice for wildlife, your first question should be, well, which wildlife species are they interested in? And we often will read information that comes out, and I've been guilty of it as well, saying that, this practice is good for wildlife. Well, we have to say, well, which wildlife? Because some wildlife don't benefit from having trees on the landscape. And some wildlife need complete forest, not open fragmented trees like an alley cropping or windbreak system might provide. And then when you find the species of interest, then you should look at on the property or in this area or in this watershed, what are the habitat factors that are most limiting for that species, and that can it be provided on this piece of property. And so it's not just a simple question of yes, it's good for wildlife. On the other hand, by having a diversity of structure, of types of plants, of types of food, we can provide a greater diversity of habitat for a greater diversity of wildlife than we will see over, say, a monoculture of a cool season pasture or a cornfield or soybean field or wheat field. And but it is going to favor species, wildlife species that are edge type species. One in particular, when we list beneficial insects, pollinators continue to be an interest and concern across the country. And one thing to keep in mind, whether it's alley cropping and windbreaks, is that by looking at the flowering season or time of year that your crops flower and choosing trees or shrubs that have a different flowering time, we can provide food and nectar for a greater part of the growing season, because the bees, be they wild or the honeybees, need food throughout the year. And if we have these large monocultures, all those plants come and provide food at just a narrow period of time during the year when these insects, beneficial insects, need pollen and nectar. And the other thing about, we talked about microclimate modification earlier with reduced wind speeds and having perennial vegetation on the landscape. That also provides nesting habitat or a more beneficial habitat for the insects to do their pollinating. There's plenty of research that indicates as wind speeds are reduced, pollinating insects are more effective, they spend more time pollinating, and they get to more plants because they're not having to fight the wind. And they will venture further out away from the woody plants when there's wind speed reduction, and pollinate more plants further from the windbreak or the tree planting. So having untilled ground, which is good nesting cover, or providing space for plants to grow that have hollow or pithy stems for native pollinators, as well as the improved habitat and improved forage, are all some of the things that can be considered if pollinators and pollinator habitat is a concern of the producer or in the area. So what are some of the issues or concerns that you or the producer should be aware of before venturing into doing something like alley cropping? Well, it involves much more intensive management. We talk about diversification. We talk about putting these plants close together and managing them. And we're managing a variety of crops in the piece of ground. So it's much more hands-on and intensive. And that is something to be taken into account. That the area where the trees or shrubs are planted is an area that's no longer producing on an annual crop, which is sort of a duh, but it's good to be reminded that as you're planting the woody crop plants, trees or shrubs, that it may be 3 to as much as 7 years or more before those really start producing a harvestable crop. And so that's going to impact the cash flow for the producer by having some of that property taken out of annual crop production while we're waiting for the perennial crop to start producing. It may complicate herbicide application, particularly if someone's using herbicides in an annual crop, a grassy crop situation, and they're using a broadleaf herbicide. Well, trees and shrubs are broadleaf plants, so it makes application of herbicides more complicated. You have to be more aware of wind speed and application methods. And now the producer is going to be looking at growing a different crop that they may not have as much experience with when you're growing a nut or fruit or food crop, or even a woody decorative floral crop in the tree row. A friend of mine down in Missouri, Mike Gold, is often fond of saying that you can find the price of commodity crops now, a week from now, price a month from now, price a year from now, and you can find that all over the internet. It's on the radio every day at noon. But try and find what is the market price for black walnuts or for apples or for cherries or for hazelnuts or some of these other crops. So there's a whole lot more involved in learning who's going to buy the plant before you even start planting it, and what is the market price, and what are they looking for? Is it size? Is it quality? Is it appearance? What are the characteristics of that plant? So it just gets more complicated. And then this seasonal labor is an item that I have down as issues, but it could be a benefit in that you have to be aware of when different management practices need to be done for the tree crop or the alley crop. Ideally you want to have, whether it's pruning or harvesting or irrigation or pesticide applications, to be spread out rather than piling up and to a point where you can't get all that work done in a reasonable time when it needs to be done in an efficient manner. On the other hand, by having a variety of crops, you can keep labor force and equipment being productive through a greater part of the year if you're choosing crops that are complementary rather than competing for resources. Light and water are the two biggest concerns for anyone involved in alley cropping, and trying to manage the light. As trees grow, they produce shade, which is generally considered to be a good thing by most folks. But some crops really require a high level of light, and some maybe not as much. And so we've done some research on how a row of trees, whether they're walnut or fruit trees, cast shade, and the percentage of an area that will receive shade, whether you're planting your rows north and south versus east and west. And we found that planting the tree rows in an east-west maximizes sunlight that gets down to the alley crop. Now, if you're planting the trees on the contour, that may not be an option, but it's good to know that somebody's gone through and really measured that shade, and the east-west orientation, if you have an option, is the way that provides the most sunlight to the space in the alley crop. And it's also good to think about, you may, when you first plant your trees or shrubs, you can recognize that they're not providing much shade at all. And you can grow a crop that may require a high amount of sunlight. And then as those trees grow taller, the crops that you grow between the rows may change to something that doesn't require as high a light intensity, or you may look to thin the trees so that you maintain, allow more light to get down to your alley crop. And so that's management of light over time. And when we think about water, this is, you'll see this if you go along and see, it's particularly evident along windbreaks. You'll often see crops very short, right adjacent to the windbreak. And there are a number of factors going on, one of which is competition for water. So there was some research done. Shibu Jose, who's down at University of Missouri, and he's done research in Indiana and Florida. And actually, this picture is one they went alongside these fairly mature trees and trenched down and put down a barrier and measured the impact on the reduced root competition for moisture out into the alley crop. And Shibu makes a big point of saying this is not something you would want to go in and do for the first time with mature trees. But if it's a concern, you could go in and create this rooting barrier when the trees are planted, so that you're not cutting off roots and altering the support structure and the water uptake structure of those trees if you were to do that to mature trees. Look at timing of fertilizer application as well as irrigation, recognizing that what part of the plant is growing at the time of the fertilizer application, because you can stimulate vegetative growth or you can help with fruit set and the size of fruit depending on your fertilizer and your irrigation applications. And also recognizing that trees and your woody plants will often start growing earlier in the growing season than will an annual crop planted between the rows. And that's just good capture of utilizing light and nutrients. And then in the growing season is when you want to be paying attention to the water and nutrient management, so that you're not starving your alley crop. But as you fertilize your alley crop, the trees are also probably going to be taking up some of the nutrient. And we see that similarly in silvopasture systems, where fertilizer is applied to pastures, that the trees are going to take up some of that as well. And that can be a benefit for your tree crop. Some other interactions to be aware of. We talk about black walnut often with alley cropping and concerns about allelopathy, and that's the juglone compound that's produced within the leaves and hulls and roots of the trees. And it has some impact on plants. There's a list in this table of some that are sensitive to juglone, some that are tolerant of juglone. We also talk about if the soils have been depleted, or just a poor soil, or it's been damaged over time because of other prior practices. Nitrogen fixing trees can help pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and get nitrogen into the soil and help improve the soil biome and nitrogen availability for neighboring plants. And then there are more and more alternate hosts for beneficial or for not beneficial insects. So again, looking at alternate hosts for insects or disease of what you're growing, both in your trees and your alley crop, would be an important. Some design considerations are, as we mentioned before, light requirements. And so looking at the trees that you might plant to create your alleyways, the type of shade they produce, the type of rooting system that they have, and how those would compete with the crops that the producer is interested in growing. And then another common question is, how far apart do we put the tree rows? that create the alley. And this is really much more of a practical question than it is a real biological interaction question. And it really ties down to the type of equipment that the producer is planning to use, and recognizing that as the trees grow, they will encroach into that alleyway. And so we often talk about if the equipment is, let's just say it's 14 feet wide, that you'd want multiples of 14 feet and then some buffer on the edge of that for the trees to grow into, so you're not having 1.5 width passes between the alleyway. You could also look at designing it in such a way that as the trees grow, you may take out, say, every other row of trees. That works in theory, but to my experience with producers and people who grow trees is once they've invested time and money and water and resources into growing trees and they see those trees up there, they're not as likely to remove a whole row. They might thin a row and provide more sunlight, but they're not likely to remove a whole row. And there is the expense and the equipment necessary to remove a whole row of trees. So looking at the width of the equipment that's likely to be used is very key in designing how wide the alleyway is going to be. And then the other design considerations: are you going to use 1 or 2 rows of trees or 3 rows of trees? You can, and the spacing within the row and between the rows. And again, this is the type of management. Often people will want to put a tall tree and a shorter shrub in the same row, and that can be done. It's important to think about how much shade the taller tree is going to provide to that shorter shrub that's in the row, and in which case you might be looking at more like a single row application where the sunlight can get to both sides of that row. And then maybe space your trees further apart so that that shrub bush in between is going to get enough sunlight to produce a reasonable crop, or plan on those shrubs over time becoming less productive as the shade increases. So we're going to close out here pretty quick in the next few slides. So choosing trees or shrubs for an alley cropping situation, you're either going to have a tree or shrub that have a marketable product. Consider is the yield for the harvest and the cash flow an annual yield, such as a nut or a fruit or a woody decorative plant, or is it going to be something that grows like wood or biomass that you're going to harvest periodically? You can consider whether the trees that you're planting provide, like we mentioned earlier, nitrogen fixing benefits to the plant. Is it maybe every other row is just to provide more wind speed reduction or winter protection? And so you're going to look at the trees and shrubs and what they can provide for the site, for the producer. And not all of those benefits are necessarily tied to a crop, but are probably going to be. So you're going to want to look at the trees that grow something you can harvest. You also want to consider how much residue falls from that plant, from the trees, and how will it interfere with your alley crop. If it's one that's just, and how you harvest, say, the nuts, are they going to be dropping at the same time or before you get your alley crop harvested? Well, that's not going to work out. So you want to consider how you harvest the nuts, or are you going to grow a forage crop that you can be hayed and provide a nice clean surface for, or a winter wheat crop that you can harvest a nice, the nuts off of the ground, an easily managed surface. So thinking about the characteristics of the tree or shrub that you're planting is important. We talk about food producing nuts and fruits, but also there is biomass. More and more producers are considering growing firewood or some other biomass that they can utilize making biochar or bedding material for livestock to be grown in the tree rows. Potential shrubs, again, are typically nut or fruit producing, although we are seeing, continue to see interest in growing some of the woody decorative florals, such as the curly willows and red and colored dogwoods, and other plants that can be used by the floral industry. And excuse me, I think they can be growing a fresh, high quality, vibrant color. It's not dried out, locally grown plant for the local floral industry. And again, looking at the yields, the amount of sun, and when they are harvested, and how does that relate to the management practices necessary for the crop in the alleyway. Alleyway crops, I've seen just about anything that you see grown in an open field, whether it's a grain crop, forage crops, vegetables and flowers, and even biomass. We've seen, what's interesting is we talk about the microclimate, that by having trees standing up above the landscape, reducing the wind speed and changing that microclimate, and have positive impacts on growth and yield of annual crops. And what is interesting, some of the research coming out of Ontario, it's old research now, shows that woody plants such as poplar or willow grown in the alleyway as a biomass crop also benefit from that same microclimate change. So those microclimate benefits extend beyond annual crops and go into perennial crops such as hay crops or biomass crops as well. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it is, and we don't have really just straightforward recipes and formulas for this, but a producer ought to be thinking about over time, as the trees grow taller and wider, how that is going to change the site. As the trees become more dominant on the site and more shade, are they going to change the crop growing in the alleyway and maybe transition to a forage crop and then, or a hay crop and then a forage crop ultimately? Are they going to thin the trees to maintain the sunlight available for the alley crop? But has it changed over time? And alley cropping could be an entryway drug into, if you want to look at that way, into silvopasture. And that, again, it helps with the cash flow of, you have an annual crop, you have your perennial crop, and then over time you can shift that over to a livestock operation, or a parcel of the ground over time becomes part of the rotation of the grazing management system. So many producers who are regularly growing annual crops, where there's that pattern of till, plant, weed control, harvest, and then go back and recycle again, aren't used to thinking about over time how the land and how that property will change as trees grow and impact that site. And it's good to be thinking about those ahead of time, rather than a producer floundering over some, which could be fairly complex decisions if the decision is put off and the trees have gotten so large and there isn't a game plan on how to transition from one type of operation to another. So a few key points that Andy Hart wanted to make sure that got brought out today is that alley cropping is not available currently through the EQIP program in Wisconsin, and possibly that'll be available in 2021. So they're working on program rules to make that a possibility. But currently, alley cropping is not eligible under EQIP. However, it is available under the Conservation Stewardship Program in Wisconsin. And he made note to saying that alley cropping is the only NRCS practice that allows non-native specialty crops to be a part of the practice, as long as they are well suited for your Wisconsin, the hardiness zones that you're working in. And that's I think important to remember that at any time is that when we're choosing trees and shrubs to grow, that we need to choose them that grow not just in hardiness zones, north and south, but on the soils that the producer has. Not that they wish they had, that we hope we might modify or improve over time, but we want to choose trees and shrubs that grow and grow well enough that they'll produce a crop. I've seen walnut trees planted on a off-site, and they're alive and they're growing, but they're not producing nuts. And so we want to make sure we're choosing our plants for the right site. And particularly if we're looking at non-native specialty crops, we also want to make sure that we are not choosing plants that are invasive or the possibility of moving off-site. That's just, no one wants to fight that battle. So Andy said, if you have questions on that, on these programs and how they're administered within Wisconsin, go ahead and get a hold of him. Some additional information, there are some websites and organizations. So the National Agroforestry Center, the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has information on alley cropping and some alley crops and things like elderberry and pecan and black walnut. The Association for Temperate Agroforestry, they meet every other year, so they'll be having an annual meeting in 2021, and excuse me, a biannual meeting in 2021. We don't have a location for that yet, but their website has some information. It's another source to go for information on agroforestry. And then the Overstory is primarily focused on tropical, but they have other information that you may find of interest, particularly on alley cropping. So in summary, we're talking about increased crop production by modification of microclimate, economic diversification, improved crop protection and protection of soil and water with better nutrient utilization, and improving soil health with alley cropping. But it's not for everyone, and it's not for every site. But if a producer's interested, it certainly can provide a lot of other benefits than beyond soil and water quality. So if you have questions, now's a good time, and hold the hard questions off for Andy when he's back in the office. So Penny, do we have any questions that have come in?
We do. There is one that came in earlier that's asked if you said that the east-west tree planting increases the sunlight to the annual crops.
Yes, what we found was if you're comparing your east-west tree row orientation versus north-south, that the east-west orientation allows more sunlight to reach the ground in the alleyway between the tree rows, all other things being equal.
And anyone, if you have questions, you can send them through the chat line, or you can unmute yourself and ask them directly to Rich. If you have any, please let us know, because we'll hang on here for a little bit. And our next presentation or webinar in this series is going to be on Friday, January 31st, same time, 8:30, same link, and it's going to be on silvopasture. And let's see, do we have anybody, any questions? If not, do you have anything to add, Rich?
No, just to say that I can be contacted directly as well, and when it gets into specifics of program application, I'd be more inclined to defer to Andy. But other questions about agroforestry, about what I know going on within other USDA organizations related to agroforestry, I'd be certainly happy to take those questions, and my email address is there, or just richard.straight@usda.gov.
Great. And there was a thank you, said it was a great and informative talk. And also, if you ever have any suggestions or questions about trainings or Wisconsin Land and Water, you can always contact me at penny@wisconsinlandwater.org. Otherwise, I think we're called a wrap. So everyone have a great day and a super weekend. And thanks again, Rich.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye, everyone.